I still remember the day I first stepped onto the 29th floor of the Glass and Steel Tower in downtown San Francisco. I was 23, fresh out of a graduate program in marketing, hungry for a place in the corporate world. The city had always called to me, a place of rolling fog, steep hills, and restless ambition. There I was, in my stiffest blazer and best heels, pushing through the revolving doors that spilled me into a glossy, marble-floored lobby. The hush of it struck me as both intimidating and electric. For months, I was simply the new girl in the marketing team at Pendleton and Swift, a major consulting firm that prided itself on delivering results to Fortune 500 clients. My days initially consisted of double-checking spreadsheets, summarizing data, and sending out carefully worded emails, always mindful of the firm's immaculate reputation. Though I worked diligently, I had little direct contact with top brass or major decision-makers. I'd hear about them through the grapevine or catch glimpses of them striding through the hallways. From the vantage point of my humble cubicle, they seemed like demigods of professionalism, entirely out of reach. Then there was Harper Sloan. Whispers of her name alone had the power to shift the office's energy. She was not only a high-level executive, director of strategic marketing, but also a figure of quiet fascination among the staff. People said she was unstoppable, top-tier MBA, impeccable track record, rumored to have turned around entire departments single-handedly. She demanded excellence, but rarely raised her voice to assert it. Her presence alone was enough to make people sit straighter. From afar, she seemed almost sculptural, tall and poised, with dark hair cut sharply at her shoulders. She favored monochromatic outfits, usually in black or charcoal, and wore them with a self-assured elegance that left everyone else looking slightly disheveled by comparison. I admired her. How could I not? She was everything I aspired to be. Confident, respected, and always in control. Months into my role, I finally had a chance to assist on a project that required her approval. It was a small piece of data analysis. Nothing groundbreaking, but it gave me an excuse to email her updates or pop into her office with short memos. I still recall the sense of awe I felt stepping into her domain, a corner office with breathtaking views of the bay, meticulously organized shelves, and a neat row of framed awards. She didn't smile much, but when I showed her the analysis, she gave me a polite nod of approval that filled me with pride. Over time, I caught her studying me in meetings, never for long, just fleeting glances that felt oddly penetrating. She always seemed to know the answers before anyone else, and had a knack for cutting through nonsense with a single, well-chosen phrase. Whenever she spoke, the entire conference room would shift its focus to her, as though the air itself turned to face her direction. There was a respect and a healthy dose of fear that surrounded her like a halo. I tried to keep my head down, telling myself that my only objective was to do well at my job, learn from the best, and stay out of trouble. And for a while, that routine was comforting. I liked the predictability of my daily tasks and the slow but steady sense of progress. Yet, in the back of my mind, something shifted whenever Harper was around. It was as if the entire office took on a silent crackle of tension, like static electricity in the air. My friends at work never seemed to notice anything beyond the standard hierarchy. Harper was the boss, we were the subordinates. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something else lurked beneath that formal dynamic. Maybe it was my own imagination. I had never truly seen her do anything that would lead me to suspect, well, anything unusual. The only thing that stood out was an occasional glance, a faint quirk of her lips when I spoke up in a brainstorming session, a slight lingering of her hand near mine when we passed documents around the table. But these were fleeting details that I chalked up to me overthinking. After all, it was easy to project fantasies onto someone so accomplished and magnetic. However, it was the smallest detail that finally changed everything. A detail so subtle, it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been hyper-aware of her every move. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the big conference room. We were reviewing a marketing deck that needed to be sent out by the end of the day. She sat at the head of the table, flipping through slides, while I, seated to her right, typed notes on my laptop. She leaned over at one point to indicate a correction in the design, and her hand accidentally brushed over mine on the keyboard. I remember feeling the warmth of her skin, the surety of her fingertips, and the way my entire body froze in that half second. She didn't yank her hand away. She gently adjusted one of my fingers on the trackpad, pointing out a specific data visualization. My heart thundered. I'm sure I made a small sound, some cross between a gulp and a startled breath, and then it was over. She withdrew her hand, resumed her explanation, and the meeting continued as if nothing had happened. But I knew, from the first moment that something had changed in me. I spent the rest of that day in a fog, replaying the memory of that moment. Why did something so seemingly trivial elicit such a strong reaction? Could it be that my admiration for her went beyond purely professional respect? Was I merely starstruck? Or did I sense an undercurrent in that brief, electric touch? The more I tried to deny its significance, the more it haunted me. I told myself that a brush of the hand was nothing. But deep down, I recognized that my pulse had kicked up a notch, that my skin felt overly sensitive, and that the memory of her gaze filled me with a clumsy mix of confusion and excitement. It was as though my carefully planned career trajectory had suddenly gained a curve I couldn't have predicted. I tried my best to bury the incident in work, hurling myself into spreadsheets and marketing briefs. But something in me had awakened, a tension I'd never felt before, a curiosity that wouldn't let me go. For the first time, I realized that I was not as safe in my routine as I'd thought, and that perhaps I didn't want to be. Because from then on, the office's hushed corridors and the 29th floor views felt charged with a potent, silent question. What happens now? After that Tuesday morning, everything changed in subtle, disorienting ways. My usual seat at the big glass conference table felt different whenever Harper was present. I found myself acutely aware of her every movement, the way she tapped her pen lightly against the table when thinking, how she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear while reading a memo, the faint arch of her eyebrow when she found something surprising or disconcerting. I questioned my own reactions constantly. Was I imagining tension that wasn't there? Was I reading too much into passing glances, routine interactions, and standard office politeness? I'd even stare at myself in the bathroom mirror sometimes, half expecting to see some telltale sign of guilt on my face. But there was nothing, just the same brown eyes and slightly flushed cheeks. I tried to chalk it up to a combination of stress and an overactive imagination. Yet late at night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, replaying the feel of her hand over mine. It didn't help that my best friend from work, Lindsay, started commenting on my distracted mood. "You seem preoccupied lately," she said one afternoon while we waited for the elevator. "Is everything okay?" Lindsay was the social glue of our department, always tuned into who was having a bad day or dealing with an office drama. If I was going to slip up and reveal my confusion, it would be to her. I forced a smile. "I'm just tired," I replied, which wasn't a total lie. My nights had become a cascade of restless thoughts, probably just the latest round of projects wearing me out. She eyed me suspiciously but shrugged. "You need a vacation." If only a vacation could solve the turmoil in my head. The next few days brought more of the same, occasional interactions with Harper, always professional but tinged with something I couldn't name. She'd pass by my cubicle and ask a question about a client deck. I'd answer, noticing how her eyes seemed to linger a fraction longer than necessary. She'd make a small comment about my diligence, and I'd feel a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the overhead lights. I'd find reasons, maybe excuses, to glance at her from across the office, a flutter in my stomach whenever I caught sight of her. Then came the first sign that maybe my instincts weren't entirely baseless. Late one evening, I stayed behind to finalize a set of slides for a meeting with a high-profile client. As the clock neared 8 p.m., most employees had already gone home. I was nearly alone on the floor, hunched over my desk. Then I heard footsteps, light, measured steps that I recognized as hers. She had a distinct cadence, each click of her heels purposeful. She stopped by my cubicle, a file in hand. "Burning the midnight oil?" she asked softly, her gaze drifting over the partially eaten salad on my desk and the lines of text on my screen. "Yes," I said, my voice coming out breathier than I intended. "I wanted to make sure these slides are perfect for tomorrow." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "I appreciate your dedication. You've done well on these projects." "Thank you." I tried to keep my voice steady. My heart was doing cartwheels in my chest. Then she did something unexpected. She leaned in, resting her free hand lightly on the edge of my desk, near where my own hand lay on the keyboard. "But you should also learn when to pace yourself. Overworking can lead to diminishing returns." It was corporate speak, yet the softness of her tone told me she meant it more kindly than a typical managerial pointer. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I just really want to do my best." "I know." Her eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, it felt like the entire floor had gone silent, like the fluorescent lights no longer buzzed, and the HVAC hum vanished. "You don't have to prove yourself every single night." I broke her gaze, glancing at her hand, which was now less than an inch from mine. Electricity coursed through me. "I guess I'm still learning how to balance everything." "That makes two of us." she whispered, as if admitting something private. Then she stepped back, as though catching herself, and straightened. I'll let you finish, but don't stay too late. With that, she left. My pulse hammered. The sense of closeness, the hush of her voice, and the fact that she lingered near my hand felt like a silent confession, though of what exactly, I couldn't be sure. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, just staring at the spot where she'd stood, trying to calm the rush of conflicting thoughts in my head. One side of me wanted to rationalize it. She's just a caring supervisor, looking out for her team. The other side, the side that had felt that warm tingle of possibility, insisted that this was more than a passing concern for an overworked employee. There was something in the air, something undeniable. In the following days, I tried to distance myself, focusing on tasks that wouldn't require her direct input. Whenever she sent me an email, my heart gave a jolt, and I'd take a moment before opening it. Her presence in a meeting forced me to keep my expression neutral, determined not to let the swirl of my thoughts show on my face. Yet no matter what I tried, I couldn't erase the memory of the near touch, the softness in her voice, the glint in her eyes that night. My internal monologue grew increasingly conflicted. This isn't smart, she's your boss, and the power dynamic alone is complicated. Even if there's something there, it can lead to trouble. For both of you. But desire doesn't always obey logic. The more I reminded myself of all the reasons this was a bad idea, the more my subconscious seemed to cling to the possibility of it. I was losing my grip on the neat lines I'd drawn around my professional life. And so, the stage was set for an inevitable confrontation, though I didn't yet know when or how it would happen. All I knew was that I was on precarious ground. The rational part of me screamed to leave this alone, to never let a personal feeling interfere with my job. But the curious part, the part that felt strangely alive for the first time in a long while, was hungry for more. I existed in that tension, day in and day out, hoping something would give, but also fearing the moment it would. By the time Friday of that week rolled around, I felt ready to collapse. Extra hours, last-minute reports, and the emotional burden of second-guessing every interaction with Harper had worn me out. I was counting the minutes until I could go home, put on some sweatpants, and binge-watch a show without checking my work email. It was around 6 p.m. when the office began to thin out. Most of my colleagues were eager to start their weekend. I was tying up a final loose end on a presentation for Monday, a standard procedure check, verifying the alignment of slides, ensuring bullet points matched the brand guidelines, that sort of thing. I had my headphones on, playing some quiet music to help me focus, so I didn't immediately notice someone had approached my cubicle. When I felt a presence behind me, I jolted slightly, tugging the headphones off. It was Harper, looking composed in her usual tailored outfit. She glanced at the spreadsheet on my screen, then met my eyes. "You're always here late," she observed, echoing her concern from earlier in the week. I gave a slight shrug, feeling that familiar tension coil inside my chest. "I like to make sure everything's in order," she nodded. "That's commendable. But you should also consider your well-being." Pausing, she tipped her head. "Listen, I need to go over a few last-minute changes for the Ralston Pharmaceutical project. I'd prefer to finalize them tonight so Monday's not a scramble. Could you spare 15 minutes or so?" My pulse quickened. I knew we were about to be alone in a quiet office at the end of a long day. For a beat, I thought of making an excuse, some urgent personal matter or pressing plan. But I also knew it was my job to assist her. And maybe some reckless part of me wanted to be alone with her. "Yes, of course," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the swirl of emotions inside. She gestured for me to follow her into one of the smaller conference rooms. The large communal ones were mostly deserted, lights off, chairs stacked. But this particular room, a cozy space meant for quick stand-up meetings, still had the lights on, casting a warm glow over the circular table. Papers and sticky notes lay scattered around from earlier brainstorming sessions. I tried to keep my posture calm as we sat side by side. She placed a binder of documents between us. "I noticed some discrepancies in the data references on slides 14 and 15, she began, flipping open the binder. "We need to be sure the figures align with the Q2 forecast." I pulled out my laptop, opening the deck for the Ralston project. "Yes, let me see." I navigated to the relevant slides. We talked business for a solid 5 minutes. I made notes, corrected percentages, and updated the brand guidelines. But as I typed, I felt her shift slightly closer. The subtle warmth of her body next to mine was oddly distracting, and I found myself tensing, hyper-aware of every small motion. I caught her glancing at me when I turned to ask a question. There was something in her eyes, an intensity that made it feel as if we weren't just reviewing slides. Finally, we reached the last bullet point. I typed the final correction, saved the deck, and exhaled. "I think that's everything," I said quietly, trying to sound normal. She nodded. "Good work," she replied, her voice soft. Then she closed the binder and placed it on the table. For a moment, we sat there in silence. The hum of distant traffic filtered through the large windows, along with the faint glow of streetlights. On the 29th floor, everything felt removed from the hustle of the city. I was about to shut down my laptop when she spoke again. "You know, you remind me a bit of myself when I started out." I glanced up, startled by the personal tone. "Really? How so?" She smiled faintly. "The determination, the late hours, the need to prove you can handle more than what's expected. I see that drive in you. It's admirable, but it can also be dangerous." My throat felt tight. Dangerous how? She looked at me, her gaze flickering across my face. "Sometimes we become so focused on meeting expectations, our own, our bosses, the company's, that we forget to ask ourselves if we're truly okay, if we're allowing ourselves room for anything else." It sounded as though she was speaking from experience. My heart twisted with empathy. The corporate world was a demanding place, and for a woman at her level, the pressures must be intense. "I guess I never thought about it that way," I said, my voice hushed. There was a charged moment of silence. Then she spoke again, her tone gentle. "May I see your slides for Monday one more time? The text might need a small tweak." "Of course." I lifted my laptop so she could look. She leaned in, one hand braced on the table, the other hovering near the trackpad. I opened the slides, my fingertips resting on the keyboard. And that's when it happened. She moved her hand to guide mine on the laptop, indicating where she wanted me to place the cursor. The touch was light, but deliberate, her fingers curling over mine as she guided them across the trackpad. My breath caught, every nerve in my body ignited by that simple contact. I froze, watching the movement of her hand over mine. A wave of warmth filled my chest, radiating outward until I felt both flushed and oddly vulnerable. The only sound was the soft click of the trackpad as she guided the cursor. Everything else vanished. The city below, the ticking of the conference room clock, even the fact that she was my boss. I didn't pull away, and she didn't let go. For a long, suspended moment, we simply held that position, her hand on top of mine. My eyes flicked from the screen to her face, and I saw an echo of the same tension that thrummed inside me. Neither of us spoke, as though any word would break the unspoken agreement that this moment was important. Then, as though awakened from a daze, I slowly slid my hand out from under hers. My heart pounded loud enough that I was sure she could hear it. I think that's good," I stammered, saving the presentation. My voice sounded high and tight, like a rubber band stretched too far. She didn't move for a second, then sat back, exhaling. "Yes," she said softly, clearing her throat. "Yes, it looks fine." Her face was composed, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, a moment of vulnerability from the otherwise unflappable Harper Sloan. I began, scrambling to gather my stuff. "I should probably head out. It's getting late." She nodded, rising from her seat. "Of course. Thank you for staying to finalize this." Her voice had returned to its usual calm neutrality, but the undercurrent of tension remained. "Have a good weekend." I nodded, mumbling something like, "You too," before practically fleeing the conference room. The corridors were dim and deserted. The overhead lights switched off in most sections. I pressed the elevator button repeatedly, my thoughts racing. I had no idea how to process that moment. All I knew was that nothing felt routine anymore. As the elevator doors slid shut and I descended floor after floor, I realized how profoundly this changed things. This wasn't just my imagination running wild. Something was happening. A spark had been lit. I couldn't decide if I was elated or terrified, maybe both. My mind spun with the implications. She was my boss. This was absolutely not normal. But oh God, had I wanted that touch to last? I spent the entire ride home in a haze. By the time I tumbled into bed, my heart still hammered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the quiet intensity in her face, felt the gentle press of her fingers over mine. I had the sense I'd stepped onto a bridge with no clear end in sight. Part of me wanted to run back to solid ground, to the safety of the usual routine. Another part urged me forward, compelled by an ache that defied logic. That weekend, I barely slept. The memory replayed on a loop. Each time I thought of returning to work on Monday, I felt both a pang of dread and a thrilling excitement, because I knew the world had shifted in that small conference room, and I didn't know how to make it shift back. Despite my restless weekend, Monday arrived just like it always did. Bright morning sun creeping through the blinds, alarm blaring too early, the smell of coffee filling my cramped apartment. I hurried into a crisp blazer, half hoping the previous Friday evening had been some bizarre dream. But I couldn't lie to myself. The memory was too vivid, and the swirl of emotions too raw. Stepping into the office, I felt hyper alert to every detail. The hum of the HVAC, the quiet footsteps of coworkers, the ping of incoming emails. My mind was on autopilot until I reached my cubicle and powered up my computer. The first message was from Harper. 3 lines about the final Ralston slides, ending with, "Please see me in my office when you're settled in." My stomach twisted. I reread the email 3 times, searching for any subtext. Nothing. Just a straightforward request. She probably wants to finalize details before the client call. I told myself, this is normal. Yet an undercurrent of nerves danced across my skin. After a few minutes of collecting myself, I stood and walked through the aisles toward her corner office. The sleek hallway reflected my figure like a subtle funhouse mirror, and I felt a pang of self-consciousness, worried that every emotion was etched on my face. Harper's assistant, Adele, was away from her desk, so I tapped lightly on the closed door. "Come in," came the cool, measured voice. I entered, shutting the door behind me. She sat behind her desk, posture immaculate, scanning a document. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing her in a halo of morning light. For a moment, she glanced up, meeting my eyes. A flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Then she gestured for me to take a seat. "Good morning," she began, setting aside her papers. "I wanted to go over the Ralston call. We'll be connecting with them in half an hour." "Sure," I said, sinking into the chair opposite her. I tried not to fiddle with my hands. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to maintain composure. She walked me through the agenda, the key metrics, the topics we'd highlight, how to answer potential questions. It was a typical prep session, strictly professional. And yet, the tension in the air was almost stifling. I watched her hands move over the desk, flipping pages, and my mind kept flashing back to the way her hand had felt over mine. It took all my willpower to maintain focus on what she was saying. After a thorough review, she paused, folding her hands. "Is everything clear?" she asked, her gaze leveling on me. I nodded. "Yes, everything's straightforward. Thanks for walking me through it." She opened her mouth as though to say something else, then hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the door. "I wanted to address something. If this is an inappropriate time, let me know." My chest tightened. "Sure, go ahead." She leaned forward slightly, voice dropping a notch. "About Friday, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. If I crossed a line, please tell me. The last thing I want is to—" "You didn't," I cut in, my voice trembling just enough to betray my nerves. "I mean, I'm not uncomfortable. I'm not sure what that was." A small frown tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not entirely sure either," she admitted softly. "It happened in the moment. I didn't plan it." My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but the biggest one was, what now? I fiddled with my pen, glancing at the door as though it might burst open at any second. "I guess we should keep things professional," I managed, though the words weighed heavily in my mouth. She nodded, but it wasn't exactly an agreement. It felt more like a reluctant acknowledgement. "Yes, professionalism is important, but I also don't want to pretend it didn't happen." Her voice carried a hint of regret. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My gaze drifted to the window, the city skyline shimmering beyond. "You're my boss," I wanted to say. "We shouldn't be having this conversation." But a deeper part of me longed to remain in the hush of her office, to see if that spark could become something more. Finally, she sighed. "The call with Ralston is in 20 minutes. Let's do our best with that. We can talk again later, if you want." I nodded, standing up on unsteady legs. "Okay," I whispered. Then, summoning a tiny smile, I said, "I'll see you in the conference room for the call." "Right," she replied, returning her attention to the document in front of her. But as I turned to leave, I sensed her gaze lingering on me. The door clicked shut behind me, and I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The rest of the day was a blur of meetings, emails, and minor crises. I managed to push aside the emotional tumult for a while, focusing on delivering results for the Ralston project. We aced the call, as far as I could tell. Harper smoothly guided the discussion, while I chimed in with data points at the appropriate moments. I felt proud when we hung up, proud of my performance, proud to be part of a team led by such a capable person. Yet, beneath that success lay a simmering confusion. I kept replaying her words. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. Neither did I. But what alternative did we have? The power dynamics? The corporate rules? The rumor mill that thrived in offices like ours? Any one of these factors was reason enough to shut down any notion of crossing that line again. Shortly after lunch, I got an unexpected Slack message from her. Do you have a few minutes to chat privately? My stomach somersaulted. Yes, I typed back, trying to keep my response casual, though my heart hammered. Where? Conference room 4B, East Wing. In 5, she replied. I read the message 3 times, my hands going clammy. She wants to talk again. I wondered if something else had come up, or if this was about that personal conversation. Taking a steadying breath, I tidied the scattered papers on my desk and headed to the designated room. Unlike her corner office, 4B was small and windowless, typically used for brief huddles. When I arrived, Harper was already there, standing at the far end of the table. She'd removed her suit jacket, draping it over a chair, leaving her in a sleek blouse that accentuated her strong posture. Close the door, please, she said, her voice controlled. I gently shut it, noticing my pulse spiking again. Is something wrong? She took a moment, seemingly collecting herself. No, not exactly. She paused, her gaze dipping momentarily to the floor before returning to my face. I wanted to clarify something. This morning, you said you're not uncomfortable, which I'm grateful for, but I also don't want you to feel pressured. I appreciated her concern, but it also stirred something in me. A tenderness that she was trying to protect me from any potential misconduct or emotional harm. I don't, I said quietly. I'm an adult. I know how to take care of myself. She nodded, tension flickering in her eyes. Of course. Still, you're on my team, and I'm your supervisor. Any personal involvement between us could be problematic, not just for the company, but for you. I don't want you to lose credibility or become the subject of office rumors. My heart sank a little. I understand. It's just, I can't deny there's something here. Even as the words left my mouth, I felt a rush of vulnerability. Her eyes softened. I feel it too, she murmured, stepping closer. And I've been trying to rationalize it away, to tell myself it's a passing attraction. But every time I see you, it's like there's a pull I can't ignore. Warmth suffused my chest, conflicting with the fear in my gut. So what are we supposed to do? I asked, voice quavering. Pretend it's nothing? That might be the safest route, logically. She inhaled sharply, as though waging an internal battle. It would be the safest, but it might not be the honest one. I took a step closer, drawn by some invisible thread. My mind shouted about the hazards of crossing this boundary, but my heart thundered with the need for clarity. I'm not sure honesty will protect us from the consequences. She dropped her gaze to my hands, which were now just inches from her. No, it won't, she said softly. Then, very gently, she reached out and placed her hand on top of mine, echoing the moment from Friday but with a deliberate tenderness. But maybe we can figure something out. My breath caught. The faint overhead light cast our shadows against the dull walls. For a second, the entire world seemed to narrow to the touch of her hand. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself feel the warmth of her skin against mine, an acknowledgement of the tension we danced around for weeks. Then, as if snapping from a trance, I realized how precarious this was. I gently slid my hand away. We should be careful, I said, trying not to sound panicked. She nodded, letting her hand fall to her side. I know. Her voice was tinged with regret. We'll keep things professional, but if you ever feel, I'll tell you, I finished softly. And you'll tell me too, if it's too much. Yes, she sighed. We'll navigate this carefully. We both stood there in the hush of the small conference room, the hum of the building's ventilation system the only sound. I felt a tumult of relief, excitement, and fear. Relief that we had an unspoken agreement. We wouldn't simply dismiss our feelings, yet we'd do our best not to blow up our professional lives. Excitement that we might explore something more, albeit quietly. And fear, because the line we balanced on was razor thin. Eventually, I broke the silence. I should probably get back to my desk. It felt odd to say such a mundane thing after the emotional weight of our conversation, but daily tasks still awaited, oblivious to our turmoil. She gave a small nod. Yes, of course. I walked away, pulse racing, trying to compose myself before stepping into the hallway. This was the turning point, I realized. The moment we'd acknowledged the possibility of something beyond a boss-employee relationship. It felt thrilling and dangerous, like stepping into a story whose ending I couldn't predict. As the days and weeks passed, the dynamic between Harper and me grew increasingly complex. On the surface, we maintained a polished veneer of professionalism. In team meetings, we hardly spoke beyond what the projects required, each of us careful not to reveal any hint of special familiarity. If coworkers noticed anything odd, they mostly kept it to themselves, though Lindsay once or twice gave me inquisitive looks, as if sensing a shift in my demeanor. But beneath that surface calm, a powerful current pulled us closer. We exchanged small gestures, a fleeting glance in a crowded hallway, a text message after hours that said little but felt like an invitation to say more, a lingering moment by the printer when no one else was around. Sometimes the tension between us felt exhilarating, making my pulse pound. Other times it felt suffocating, as though each unspoken sentiment piled into an invisible weight we carried everywhere. One evening, we found ourselves at an off-site corporate function, a big marketing summit at a swanky hotel downtown, complete with keynote speakers, networking cocktail hours, and breakout sessions. I was excited to attend because it offered a chance to hear industry experts and make connections. But part of me also buzzed at the thought of seeing Harper outside the usual office environment. After a long day of lectures and seminars, the evening reception took place in a grand ballroom. Soft lighting, jazzy background music, and fancy hors d'oeuvres gave the event a polished sheen. I mingled with other attendees, collecting business cards, sipping a glass of white wine. My eyes kept roaming the room, searching for her. Finally, I spotted her near a tall window, speaking with a pair of high-level executives. She wore a sleek, charcoal dress that highlighted her figure more than her usual suits did. There was a regal confidence in her posture that made it hard to look away. My heart fluttered. Sensing my gaze, she glanced over, her expression almost imperceptibly softening. Later, I was chatting with a colleague near the bar when Harper approached. She greeted my colleague politely, then asked me if I wanted to step outside for a moment. My colleague, none the wiser, waved us off. We slipped through a side door onto a terrace that overlooked the city lights. The late evening breeze was cool, carrying the scent of the bay. Harper leaned against the terrace railing, arms folded loosely. The orange glow of nearby streetlights danced over her features. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice quiet, gesturing at the skyline. She nodded, gazing out at the shimmering city. San Francisco always takes my breath away, even after all these years. I moved closer, resting my hands on the railing. We stood side by side, the murmur of the reception faint behind us. A moment of silence passed, weighted by the tension we carried. "How are you enjoying the summit?" she asked, turning slightly to face me. "It's been fascinating. A lot of new marketing trends, data analytics breakthroughs." My response sounded mechanical, overshadowed by the rapid beat of my heart. I licked my lips nervously. "What about you?" she shrugged. "I enjoy these events, but they can be draining, the schmoozing, the small talk. I'm more interested in the actual substance." We shared a small laugh, a sense of camaraderie flickering between us. Then her gaze dropped to my hand resting on the railing. Carefully, she placed her hand over mine, just for a second. The touch was discreet, but potent enough to send a rush of warmth through me. I stiffened, my eyes darting toward the terrace door. Anyone could walk out here and see, but the risk was overshadowed by the simple fact that, for once, we weren't in the office or a stuffy conference room. The tension that had been building for weeks found a moment's release. I dared to press my fingers lightly against hers. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice a gentle murmur. Concern threaded her words. I hesitated, searching her face. "Yes and no," I admitted. "I mean, I can't stop thinking about this, about you. It's a lot to balance." She looked pained. "I know. Believe me, I wrestle with it too. Part of me thinks we should shut this down completely. But another part," she broke off, inhaling deeply. "Another part can't let it go." My heart ached with that same conflict. "I'm afraid," I whispered, "of what happens if we keep going, and also if we don't." Harper's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "I don't want to hurt you," she said. "I don't want you to face any fallout at work. And I don't want to sabotage everything I've built here either, but you matter to me more than I expected. A wave of emotion rose in my chest. I glanced around the terrace, reassuring myself that we were alone. Then, summoning a trembling courage, I turned my hand to lace my fingers through hers. The warmth of her hand felt grounding. You matter to me, too, I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. For a second, we stood there, hands entwined, gazing at each other under the muted city glow. The moment felt like an unspoken promise, or perhaps a confession, but it was fleeting. We both knew we couldn't stand there forever, risking speculation. Reluctantly, we broke apart, letting the cool night air settle between us. "We should go back in," she said softly. I nodded, adjusting the strap of my purse on my shoulder. "Yes, before anyone notices we're gone." Her expression was tinged with regret. "I'll see you tomorrow, then." "Yes," I replied. "Tomorrow." Back inside, the reception's bright lights and mingling crowd felt jarringly normal. I forced a cheerful mask, shaking hands, chatting about marketing strategies. All the while, my mind replayed the press of Harper's fingers. Her words, "You matter to me." That was the first time I realized how deeply she might care, and it both thrilled and scared me. I recognized that this wasn't just about fleeting desire. Feelings were involved, and feelings made everything more complicated. The next few days only intensified the emotional stakes. We continued to steal small moments, but both of us seemed haunted by the knowledge that we were playing with fire. Rumors in an office environment can spread like wildfire. One stray comment or a single indiscreet glance could set tongues wagging. And if HR got wind of any romantic involvement between a director and a direct subordinate, the repercussions would be serious. One late afternoon, Harper texted me from across the office. "Need to speak with you about the Ralston follow-up." My office, 6 p.m. My heart hammered at the idea of being alone again with her after hours. Still, it was my job to follow her directive, so I typed a simple, "Understood." At 6 p.m., I gathered my laptop and approached her office with cautious anticipation. The floor was nearly empty, just a few stray employees finishing up tasks. I slipped in and shut the door. She stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out over the city's golden sunset. Without turning, she spoke. "I'm sorry I had to wait until now. I was stuck in meetings all day." "It's okay," I said, stepping closer. "What's the update?" She turned to face me, her expression torn. "I do have updates on Ralston, but that's not the only reason I asked you here." She leaned against the windowsill, exhaling slowly. "I can't keep pretending that I'm fine with how this is playing out. The secrecy, the worry that we'll be discovered, it's weighing on me, and I suspect it's weighing on you too." I clutched my laptop, my stomach twisting with a mix of relief and anxiety. "Yes, it is," I confessed. "I'm always on edge, worried someone will notice how we look at each other or—" I trailed off, cheeks flushing. She stepped toward me, gently taking the laptop from my arms and setting it aside on a small table. "Then let's figure out a plan," she said softly. Her eyes flicked to the door. "Either we draw a line, maintain an impeccable distance, or we find a way to be together that won't destroy us." My heart clenched. A swirl of emotions battered me. Love, fear, longing, guilt. How can we be together? The rules, the gossip, the power imbalance, it's all stacked against us. She reached out, her hand coming to rest lightly on my shoulder. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted, "but I know ignoring this is impossible. Maybe we speak to HR about transferring you to a different department, somewhere you'd still thrive, but not directly under my supervision. Or maybe I find a role that doesn't involve direct oversight of your projects. It's not ideal, but it might be a compromise." The idea stung. I'd worked hard to become part of her marketing team, and I valued the opportunities I had there. But part of me saw the logic. "That's a big step," I said. "Wouldn't people suspect something if I suddenly transferred after climbing up in your department?" She sighed. "Possibly, but it might still be more discreet than if someone catches us in an undeniable situation." Her voice trembled on that last phrase. My mind raced with the weight of the decision. Changing departments or roles could impact my career trajectory, but staying in this limbo was becoming increasingly difficult. "Let me think about it," I said softly. "Of course." She squeezed my shoulder gently. Then, as if compelled by the gravity of our conversation, she let her hand slide down my arm until our fingers intertwined. I just want you to know I'm serious about finding a path forward. Not just for me, but for you too. In that moment, an overwhelming surge of tenderness and vulnerability coursed through me. I closed my eyes, leaning in until my forehead brushed hers. We stayed like that for a heartbeat, breathing quietly, the outside world forgotten. The lines we'd drawn felt dangerously close to snapping. If anyone walked in, we'd have no explanation, but it was so hard to resist the pull of closeness after so many weeks of tension. After a few long seconds, she eased back, releasing my hand. "We should do the Ralston updates," she said, forcing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We can't afford to let them slip." I nodded, swallowing hard, and retrieved my laptop. As we dove into the business details, the air remained charged with unresolved longing. Neither of us said another word about the personal matter. By the time I left her office an hour later, my heart felt heavy, and I wondered how long we could keep living in this in-between state. The next major turning point came faster than I anticipated. Word began to spread internally that some employees were being interviewed by HR about team culture and workplace environment. At first, it seemed innocuous. Pendleton and Swift sometimes did random check-ins to ensure compliance with policies and overall employee satisfaction, but the timing set my nerves on edge. Every time I heard the letters HR, my stomach knotted. Then, one day, I got an email with the subject line, HR confidential discussion. My hands turned clammy as I opened it. The message asked me to schedule a short meeting to discuss the workplace climate and any concerns. I couldn't tell if it was standard or if someone had raised suspicions about me and Harper. When I told Harper about the email, she looked uncharacteristically rattled. "I received one, too," she confessed, her expression grim. "We need to be extremely careful. If there's any rumor about us, it could lead to an investigation." My worst fears jostled to the forefront. I thought about all the subtle interactions, the stolen moments. We've been discreet, but maybe not enough. A single slip of the tongue from a colleague who noticed too much could be catastrophic. The HR meeting was set for a Friday morning. I arrived feeling nauseous, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. The HR representative, an amiable woman named Claudia, smiled as she offered me a seat. She began with general questions about my satisfaction at the company, workload, and team support. I answered with cautious positivity, trying to sound as normal as possible. Then Claudia's tone turned slightly more pointed. "We've heard some employees mention that certain team members seem to receive more one-on-one time or preferential treatment. Have you noticed anything like that in your department?" My breath hitched. I forced a careful smile. "I'm not sure what you mean. Our department is fairly structured. Everyone has clear responsibilities." She made a note on her pad. "In particular, your manager might have spent extra hours mentoring or assisting you personally. Have you felt that's been unfair to others, or that it crosses any professional boundaries?" My chest tightened. The question felt like a direct probe into my relationship with Harper. I wouldn't say so," I stammered. "She's definitely hands-on in terms of guidance, but I believe it aligns with the company's emphasis on developing talent." Her eyes flicked up, scanning my expression. "So, you don't feel any lines have been blurred? No concerns about professional boundaries or potential conflicts of interest?" I swallowed. "No, not at all," I lied, my voice steadier than I felt inside. Claudia nodded, scribbling another note. "Thank you. If there's anything else you'd like to share, or any concerns you have, my door is always open." I forced a polite smile, said a brief thanks, and practically fled the room. My heart was in my throat. The conversation had felt like walking through a minefield, aware that one misstep could detonate everything. Later that day, Harper texted me. They asked me similar questions. "We need to be absolutely sure we're maintaining appearances." I stared at her message, my mind spinning. Could we truly keep going? Or would we be forced to end things to protect ourselves? That weekend, we'd planned to meet at a coffee shop, neutral ground away from the office. Neither of us wanted to speak about such delicate matters at Pendleton and Swift, where prying eyes might notice. I arrived first, settling into a corner table. My nerves crackled, but I also felt a small thrill. Meeting outside of work felt strangely liberating. When Harper entered, wearing a casual sweater and jeans, she looked so different from her corporate persona. She greeted me with a subdued smile, and I felt a wave of affection for her that made my chest ache. We ordered coffees, then sat quietly for a moment, letting the hum of the cafe envelop us. "How are you holding up?" she asked, stirring a bit of sugar into her latte. Her tone was soft, concerned. I shook my head. Not great. The HR talk really scared me. I hate lying. I had to deny everything, but I felt like they could see right through me. Her expression tightened. I told them we had a professional mentor-mentee relationship, which is true, technically, but I also downplayed how often we collaborate. I took a shaky sip of my coffee. So what do we do now? She glanced around to ensure no one was listening. I think we have to make a decision, she said quietly. We can't keep hovering in this gray area. Every day we risk being found out. A storm of conflicting emotions swelled within me, but I don't want to just end whatever this is. Neither do I, she whispered. But the alternative is to formalize a solution. We talked about a departmental transfer. Maybe it's time to pursue that seriously. If we do it the right way, we can keep speculation at a minimum. My eyes brimmed with tears I tried to suppress. But that means giving up my spot on your team. I've worked hard there. She reached across the small table and grazed my hand with her fingertips. A gesture so gentle it nearly broke me. I know, but we can't have it both ways. Remain in a direct report situation and be together, even discreetly. So either we continue denying this until it blows up in our faces, or we risk a strategic move. I closed my eyes, feeling the pressure of an impossible choice. I need time to think, I said finally. She nodded, retracting her hand. Take the weekend, but HR is sniffing around, so we can't delay for long. We parted with a subdued goodbye. I spent the rest of the weekend in turmoil, weighed down by the knowledge that I might have to leave the job I loved, or worse, leave the person I was growing to deeply care for. Neither option felt fair. Come Monday morning, an email from HR awaited me, asking me to clarify some points from our previous discussion. I felt my chest seize with anxiety. I shot Harper a quick message. They want a follow-up. I'm worried, she replied swiftly. Let's talk at lunch. We'll figure it out. But I never made it to lunch with her. Around 11 a.m., I received a forwarded email from an unknown address, containing an attached screenshot. My heart hammered as I opened it. The screenshot showed a snippet of a chat conversation that might have been between me and Harper, referencing meeting after hours, complete with affectionate language. My mind whirled. Was it real? Fabricated? Did we slip up on a text chain? I couldn't recall. Panic surged. Whoever had this screenshot wanted to create trouble. The email said, I think HR would be interested in this. Care to comment? Terrified, I rushed to Harper's office, but her assistant said she was in a closed-door meeting with HR. My blood ran cold. They already have this or something similar, and they're confronting her. I returned to my cubicle in a daze, trying to hold it together. Emails blurred before my eyes as I waited for some sign of what was happening. Over an hour later, Harper finally emerged, face pale, eyes stormy. She motioned me into a vacant side office. Closing the door, she took a sharp breath. Someone's feeding HR questionable evidence that we're involved. They had partial chat logs. It might be fabricated or partially real. Some of our texts, but also some lines that aren't ours. I denied it, said we must be the target of some malicious rumor. My eyes burned with unshed tears. So what happens now? She ran a hand through her hair, uncharacteristically flustered. HR says they need to do a formal investigation, which means they'll be looking at phone records, chat logs, everything. She gazed at me with desperation in her eyes. I'm so sorry. I fought back a sob. We tried to be discreet. Who would do this? She shook her head. I don't know, but it doesn't change the reality. The company will want to see if there's an inappropriate relationship, and if they find grounds, they could terminate one or both of us for violating policy. My entire body felt numb. I can't lose my job, I whispered. I can't face that. Her jaw tightened. I know. That's why we have to be proactive. Before I could respond, the door opened. A flustered HR rep stepped in, eyes darting between Harper and me. We need to speak with you both, the rep said, individually. In that moment, the precarious house of cards we'd built came crashing down. My mind swirled with regret, fear, and heartbreak. We'd gambled on secrecy and lost. Now, everything we'd tried to protect was on the verge of being torn apart. The following week was one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever endured professionally or personally. The HR investigation was swift and invasive, as they pored over our emails, chat logs, even calendar entries that might hint at unusual meetings. We were questioned separately, asked to explain any ambiguous messages or late-night scheduling. Though we tried to keep our answers consistent, the tension was unbearable. Every day, I came to work not knowing if it would be my last. As the storm raged, Harper and I hardly spoke outside official channels, fearful that any conversation might add fuel to the fire. I caught glimpses of her in the hallways, tired, eyes downcast. My heart ached. This was never how I imagined things would end if they ended at all. Then, 3 days later, I received a summons from HR. In a small, windowless room, the HR manager sat across from me, hands folded. After reviewing the evidence, we can't conclusively prove a direct violation of policy, she began. But there's enough concern about boundary crossing that we're recommending a departmental restructuring. My stomach lurched. Restructuring? She nodded. You'll be moved to a different branch of marketing, under a different manager. Harper will remain director of strategic marketing, but you two will have minimal overlap. This ensures no direct reporting line and mitigates any potential conflict of interest. Do you understand? I swallowed hard, nodding. Yes. Part of me felt relief that I wasn't being terminated, but another part of me felt heartbreak. This was a forced separation, a formal decree to keep us apart. After the meeting, I found Harper waiting for me outside the HR office. She looked exhausted, yet there was a flicker of relief in her expression. They told me the outcome, she said quietly. I nodded, biting my lip to keep from crying right there in the hallway. Looks like we won't be working together anymore, she offered a sad smile. At least you're not fired. I was so afraid they might do that to you. Tears threatened to spill. What about us? I whispered. Her gaze dropped. They strongly advised I maintain professional distance to avoid any future misunderstandings. She hesitated. We could still see each other outside of work, but I don't know if that's realistic. We'll constantly be under scrutiny, and if any rumor restarts, it could end your new position too. A hollow ache settled in my chest. So this is it. She reached for my hand, then seemed to remember where we were and dropped her own hand to her side. Maybe for now, she murmured. I don't want you to lose your career because of me, and I can't risk compromising my entire department. It's complicated. That evening, the weight of the entire ordeal pressed down on me like a heavy cloak. I sat in my apartment, lights off, replaying every moment of our connection, the first brush of our hands, the stolen glances, the quiet confessions. All of it had led to a forced separation that made me wonder if we should have never given in to those sparks at all. In the weeks that followed, I started my new position in a different wing of the marketing division. My desk moved. I reported to a manager I barely knew, and I was assigned new projects. Everyone acted as though it were a standard restructuring, but subtle whispers circulated. A few coworkers eyed me curiously, as if trying to decipher the real reason for my reassignment. I tried to keep my head high, reminding myself that at least I still had a job. Harper and I exchanged only polite greetings in public spaces. Our interactions reduced to stilted small talk. Occasionally, we passed each other in the hallway, and a quiet sadness flickered in her eyes, a mirror of my own regret. We never again had the chance for private conversations. Perhaps neither of us dared to risk it. Months later, rumors died down. The office found new gossip topics, a senior executive retiring, a departmental shakeup in finance. I buried myself in my new role, forging relationships with fresh teammates, trying to prove myself all over again. It was lonely, but it was also a chance to start clean. The memory of her still lingered in the corners of my mind. Sometimes, I wondered if it had all been a fever dream, or a test from the universe, one I failed or passed, depending on how you looked at it. I occasionally glimpsed her name in email chains or saw her from afar in company-wide meetings, looking as composed and powerful as ever. A pang of longing would wash through me, followed by a hollow acceptance that things had changed irreversibly. One afternoon, out of the blue, I received a short email from her. Hope your new team is treating you well. Proud of your Q3 results. Harper. My throat tightened. It was the smallest gesture, yet it reminded me that some part of her still cared, still noticed. I typed a brief reply, thanking her for the note, but left it at that. We both knew we couldn't slip back into old patterns. Time moved on. My life settled into a steady rhythm. New projects, occasional coffee breaks with Lindsay, evenings spent reading or grabbing a drink with friends. In quiet moments, I'd think about the path not taken, the risk we could have embraced, the ways we might have navigated the corporate labyrinth together. But the memory of HR inquiries and that dreaded screenshot overshadowed the daydreams, reminding me how precarious it all had been. Sometimes I wondered if one day, circumstances might shift. Maybe we'd cross paths in a different workplace or find ourselves in roles that no longer threatened each other's careers. A foolish, hopeful part of me clung to the possibility of a second chance. But for now, the distance had to remain. Reflecting on it all, I don't see the experience as a mere error or scandal. It was a chapter that taught me about the powerful currents of attraction and the real-life constraints that can suffocate them. I learned about the fragility of professional boundaries, how quickly they can erode under the weight of genuine feelings. And I learned that sometimes, desire and love aren't enough to overcome the pragmatic demands of life. That realization is painful, but perhaps it's also a sign of growth. Standing here, I still feel the echo of her touch on mine, the warmth that felt so genuine and full of promise. I sometimes ask myself, if I could go back to that first moment when our hands brushed, would I pull away immediately, or would I let it linger again? The answer isn't as straightforward as I once imagined. Maybe we were always on a collision course, and maybe the heartbreak was inevitable. Or maybe it was worth it, even if fleeting, to experience that kind of connection with someone I admired so deeply. And so, if you find yourself in a moment where the line between professional and personal blurs under the pressure of a single touch, ask yourself, am I prepared for the fallout? Because sometimes, the quiet rush of electricity in an office hallway can upend everything you've built. And sometimes, the risk is a stepping stone to a profound, if temporary, kind of understanding. As for me, I can't say I regret it entirely. Regret implies I wish it never happened. And the truth is, that brief, intense chapter with Harper awakened a part of me that had been dormant, a part that yearns, that feels, that dares to hope. Even though it ended with rearranged apartments and lingering sadness, it also left me with a better understanding of who I am and what I want. Perhaps, in the grand scheme, that's enough. So here I stand, a few months older, a bit wiser, and still carrying the memory of the moment her hands rested on mine in that dimly lit conference room. The moment that whispered of possibilities and sealed our fate all at once. I don't know if our paths will cross again in a way that allows us to explore what might have been, or if we'll remain polite acquaintances in the corporate labyrinth. But no matter how life unfolds, that moment will forever remind me that sometimes it's the silent gestures, the unspoken touches, that change everything, and that not every story has the perfect resolution we might wish for.